Yo, 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 what's up, everybody? This your boy Isaac,
And this is your boy Bryce.
and we are brothers on tennis. And guess what, y'all? We figured we would come to you today and talk with you about some of the basics of tennis. Because we recognize that there are a lot of new listeners to this podcast, and we want to make sure that you are fully equipped to follow what we're saying and understand the game of tennis. So we're bringing to you what we call BOT, or Brothers on Tennis 101. Bryce, how about that 101?
Well, I want to put a disclaimer out there. So
Ha!
we're going to give you kind of a very high level overview of the game of tennis, the professional tour rankings, how the tournaments, the different surfaces. But if you're really remedial, you're going to need to put in some work yourself. So
Don't be scared.
I know this is not a college curriculum course. So the internet of things is fairly free. So
Right.
get out there and do some research yourself. But hopefully this episode helps many of our listeners.
That's right. That's right. So what we are going to start off is some of the basics. And we're really going to start with scoring because we've heard from some of our listeners that they don't necessarily understand or they can't follow the actual scoring of tennis. So tennis is really broken down into a few things. Initially, you have what are called points, and you play a point. So the person serves the ball, the opponent hits it back, and they keep it within the lines until someone either makes an error or hits a winner or whatever the case may be. And I probably need to explain winners and errors as well. But in a nutshell, you play in a point, and a point is the starting point of tennis. So whenever you, as a server, wins a point, it goes to what's called 15 love. Okay, and I know the scoring of tennis can be very, very confusing because some folks are like, why don't you just say one versus two? And they actually do that in what's called World Team Tennis. But in the normal game of tennis, they have scoring, which is 15, 30, 40. And depending on if you are the same at the end of 40. And when I say the same, if you've earned 3 points, your opponent has earned 3 points, therefore it's 40-40. That is what not a lot of people, but that's what we call deuce, D-E-U-C-E. So you have deuce, and then at that point, it goes into what's called add or deuce. So if I am serving at deuce and I win the point, then it is my advantage or add in. If my opponent wins the point, then it is their advantage or add out, right? So then whoever wins that next point, well, I shouldn't say that. If it's add in and I win the next point, then that's game for me. If my opponent has add out and they win the point, then it is their game. If the opponent has add out and I win the point as the server, it goes back to deuce, and we repeat that cycle until someone actually earns 2 points, and then they take that game. And I know that is very, very, very confusing, but stick with me, folks. We're going to kind of bring that back. So again, yep, go ahead, Bryce.
And Isaac, I just wanted to add a couple things. So we didn't define what zero is, and when you have no points, that's what we call love. So
right.
if the score is 1-0, it would be 15 love. And
Right.
the other thing that I just wanted to add is a good way to think about deuce is exactly like Isaac said, it represents when two players have both won 3 points each and they're tied. But when you're at deuce point, that means you have to win 2 points consecutively to win the game.
That's
So if you lose the first point, then you actually have to win the next point to take it back to deuce. So just wanted to make sure we threw out what love meant and also what deuce means from a playing standpoint when you're at that point.
Absolutely. Great additions, Bryce. Yeah, and that's very key because you always hear love in the game of tennis, so you want to understand what that represents. So anytime someone says 15 love, 30 love, 40 love, That's basically saying that the person does not have any points. Whoever has love, they have not earned a point as of yet. All right?
And, and if somebody beats you at love, they don't really love you.
Exactly. They not
Just
showing you
saying.
no love, right? They ain't showing you no love. So that's when you want to give them that love back. That's when you want to give the love back. Okay? So that is sort of the basics around points. So again, scoring is love or zero. Then you go to 15. Then you go to 30. And I know some people would be like, well, why don't you go to 45 since you're going in multiples of 15? I can't answer that question. All I know is it goes from love, which is 0, to 15, 30, and then 40, and then it goes back and forth between the deuce and the advantage, like Bryce was mentioning. So that is sort of the points and the initial scoring as it relates to tennis. And so when you get a game, that is where you actually start taking a set score. Now, a set is anything up to the number of games being 6. Now, there are certain differences to that, which I will go into a little bit further. But anytime you can win 6 games, you actually can win a set. So you can win a set 6 love or 6-0. You can win a set 6-1 or 6-2 or 6-3 or 6-4. All of those are valid set scores. But you cannot win 6-5. Okay? You have to win your set by 2 games, even though there's even a difference there. So if you are at 6 games, or let's just say you're at 5 games, and your opponent is at 4, and they hold their serve, and then it's 5 all. Well, if you hold your serve and it becomes 6-5, you don't win that set because you have to win by 2. Now, if after the server, if you were able to take that next game, then you could actually win the set, and the set score would be 7-5 because you've won now by 2 games. But in that scenario, if your opponent actually holds that game, it then becomes 6-6. And what then gets implemented is what they call a tiebreaker. Okay? So, Bryce, I just want to stop right there. Is that enough as it relates to set scoring? Is there anything that I missed in there that I should quantify with our listeners?
No, I think you did a great job.
Awesome. Fantastic. So, if we are at 6-6, everyone, then we go into what's called a tiebreaker. And a tiebreaker it follows a different scheme in the sense that whoever can get to 7 points will actually then win the tiebreaker. But you have to get to 7 points and win by 2. So similar to how we were talking about when you're at 6-5, you don't win. That's the same thing in a tiebreaker. You play points, and whenever you get up to 7, if you have an advantage of 2, you can win that particular tiebreaker and thus win the set. But if you're in the tiebreaker and the score is 6-5, you don't win. The person has to win that next point and get to 7-5. But if they don't and it gets to 6-all, you continue to play those points until someone can win 2 points in a row, and you then win by 2. So the set score can be, tiebreak score can be 8-6, 9-7, 10-8, 11-9, so on and so forth. So that's sort of the scoring for the actual tiebreaker. So if you can win by 2 points, then you win the tiebreaker and thus you win the actual set. Okay. Anything I miss in there, Bryce? Because it's kind of crazy when it gets to set scores and tiebreakers.
No, doing a great job.
Awesome, awesome. So that is what makes up a particular set in tennis. And most times on the WTA tour, not most times, but all the time, they play what's called the best 2 out of 3 sets, meaning that if you can win 2 sets from your opponent, you've then won the match. Okay, and then that's when it's done, and you move on in the draw, which we'll probably have to explain that as well. But for the most part, if it's best 2 out of 3, that means you have to win 2 sets in order to win that match. And the same thing holds true on the men's side for the majority of their tournaments, excluding the Grand Slams. So their tournaments are basically best 2 out of 3. Again, if they can win 2 sets from their opponent out of the 3, then they actually win the match, and then they move on in the particular draw that they're in. Okay, and so that's how you talk about matches. Now, in a Grand Slam, on the men's side, it's a little different because they actually go best 3 sets out of 5. So only in the Grand Slams, and well, actually, it's not just the Grand Slams; it's also the year-end championships. But we'll talk about that in a few minutes. But in the Grand Slams for the men, it is best 3 sets out of 5. So that means you have to take 3 sets in order to win the match out of a total of 5. So if you win 3 in a row, you don't have to play sets 4 and 5. Or if you win the first 2 sets, you lose a set, and then you win the fourth set, you've won that match. So again, best 3 out of 5 for Grand Slams for the men. And I think at a high level, Bryce, I think that kind of covers scoring. Is there anything that I should add, or what do you think?
No, I think that was great. And once again, if listeners are interested in understanding more of the history of the game, more of the history of how the scoring came about, why it goes from 30 to 40 instead of 30 to 45, the internet is your friend. So
That's right.
enjoy that. So, what I like to do right now is I like to talk about the surfaces. Now, what is key to understand is that every tennis court is not built the same way. And what I mean by that is, yes, every tennis court has the same measurements and the same dimensions, but the actual surface of the court can be different. And there are four main surfaces that tennis is played on: clay, hard court, grass, and what we call indoor or carpet. Now, when we say carpet, no, we're not talking about what's in your grandmother's living room, right?
We're not talking about the shag.
No, we're not talking about the shag. We are talking about a synthetic surface that is really placed on top of like almost wooden boards indoors that simulates kind of a hard court surface. So a lot of times the indoor surface and hard courts are viewed very similarly. Now, these four surfaces that tournaments are played on, they all have different attributes, and I like to walk through them from the slowest to the fastest. So the slowest surface is clay, and that clay court tournaments are really all throughout the year, believe it or not, but their main season is really pretty much in the spring. And the key attributes with clay is that it is the slowest of all surfaces. It really responds well to spins, especially top spin, very high bouncing balls. And it slows down the pace of the game. So typically, players that have big serves, those are nullified a bit on clay. And for those people that are typically more consistent with their ground strokes and like to rally and have longer points that build, they typically do better on clay. Clay is also a surface where you probably have some weaker footing there because many times you actually have to slide into your shot versus actually running up to it, planting your feet, and hitting. So if you're not used to that motion of actually sliding into your shot, that could be a difference. Then you have hard courts. And hard courts are probably the truest of all the surfaces because they're they're very even. You have a consistent bounce. They're faster than clay, and I've always regarded them as probably the most even surface for all playing styles. Now, the hard court season is usually in the late part of the summer. There is a small hard court season at the beginning of the year, and it's probably the only surface that has two kind of true broken up sections in the year: beginning of the year and late summer. Now, hard courts are most prevalent in the United States, and I should have mentioned that clay courts are most prevalent in Europe and in South America. Now, with a hard court, You do get the benefits of all your spins, big servers, have an advantage on hard court. The pace of play is relatively quick, and it is the surface for the Grand Slam tournament, the U.S. Open. And I should have mentioned that the clay Grand Slam tournament is the French Open. Then you have indoor, and indoor once again is very close to hard court. The difference is it's maybe even a little faster than a hard court, but it has a lower bounce as well. So typically, once again, players that have big serves maybe are more interested in shorter rallies or coming into the net. Those type of players tend to do well on indoor surfaces. Now, the indoor season, as you could probably imagine, is in the fall and the back half of the year. Now, we don't have any Grand Slam tournaments indoor, but we do have the year end championships that are typically played indoor. And then finally, the fastest surface has always traditionally been grass. And grass has the shortest season of all of them in the middle of the summer, about a 4 week span. And they have the granddaddy of the Grand Slam tournaments, and that would be Wimbledon. Now, with grass courts, people with big serves and balls that slide, and whether they slide because of a low slice or because they're getting bad bounces and the ball is sliding and hitting a painted line, it makes playing on the surface sometimes a little bit unpredictable. So it rewards the player that wants the shorter point. If you're the type of player that's looking to be out there and to hit 15 and 20 rally points, that's probably not going to hold up on grass. Now, one of the things that I want to say about all the surfaces, with the exception of maybe clay and indoor, so I guess I'm really talking about grass and hard courts, because the style of play over the last 20 years has become more about baseline rallies and powerful ground strokes and powerful serves. Many tournaments have taken a measure to slow down the courts. So on a hard court, the more sand that you add into the paint mixture, the slower you can make the court. And I remember a number of years back when they intentionally did that at the U.S. Open. Also on grass, the way that you manicure the grass and different types of grass that you may grow can slow or speed up the pace of play as well. So in general, most of the surfaces are a little bit slower than they used to be, but those are your four main surfaces that all tournaments are played on. Isaac, any additional comments about the surfaces?
No, no, I think you handled that and was very clear, my man. Very good.
Great. Well, let's transition now into, now you know how to keep score, and now you know what the different surfaces are. Let's talk about the actual tournaments that the professional players play. So there are two tours. Obviously, there's the men's tour that is called the ATP, the Association of Tennis Professionals, and then there's the WTA for the women, which is the Women's Tennis Association. Now, there are a couple of things or tournaments that the men's and the women's tour have in common, but the majority of the tours are separate. Now, something that they share is the most or the biggest tournaments that the men and the women play are what we call the majors, or they are also called the Grand Slam tournaments. And you're probably already aware of what those four are: the Australian Open, the French Open, the US Open, and Wimbledon. Now, with these majors, or like we say, Grand Slam tournaments, if you win all four of them in a calendar year, only in a calendar year. So that meant you won the Australian first, you won the French next, you won Wimbledon next, and you won the U.S. Open next. Then that's called a Grand Slam. A lot of time people call the individual tournaments Grand Slams of Wimbledon, talk about Wimbledon, the U.S. Open, the French, Australian. That is not true. Those are not considered Grand Slams. They are considered Grand Slam tournaments. And 4 Grand Slam tournaments in the same calendar year equates to winning the Grand Slam. And it's very interesting because I was looking up a bit of history on this, like where did that term come from? And believe it or not, the term comes from a card game called Whist. And Isaac and I are very familiar with a variation of that game that we've grown up playing with our families called Bid Whist.
That's right.
And in that game, if you won all of the tricks or the books but one, that was called a small or a little slam. If you won all the tricks or books, that was called a grand slam. And the funny thing is, we always grew up, in my family, in my community, if you won all the books, that was called going to Boston. Right?
That's right.
that's that's what we called it, but it was actually back in the day called a grand slam. And golf was the first sport to pick up that name and to start referring to it as their major tournaments in their sport, and tennis was right behind. So when you come below the majors, the next most important tournament for both the men and the women is their year-end championships. Now, this is something that Isaac's going to talk a little more about when he talks about rankings in a few minutes. But for the top 8 women and men's players, they play a tournament at the end of the year that's called the year-end championships, and many times it helps to determine who's going to be the number one year-end player for that year. That tournament is only second to the majors. And then when you come down to the next level, the men have what we call Master Series tournaments. And there are 9 of them that they play throughout the year. And it'd be interesting to see if I can remember them. You have Indian Wells, Miami, Monte Carlo, Madrid, Rome, Canada, Cincinnati, Shanghai, and Paris.
Nice. Very good.
Yeah. So these tournaments are heavily weighted, and you usually have a very good turnout from all the top players. Now, the women's equivalent to the Masters, even though they have, I think, more than 9, they're called the Premier tournaments. And once again, that just means they're one of the higher tournaments in terms of money, in terms of points, and you usually get most, if not all, of your top ranked players out to those tournaments. And then the final level I'm going to cover is for the men below the Masters, or sometimes they call them, the 1000 series, is you have the 500 series. And once again, just another level down from the Masters. And on the women's side, they're called the international tournaments. So as it relates to this podcast, we typically will only talk about the majors, the year end, the Premier and the Masters, and the International and the 500s. The men also have 250 level tournaments, and they have kind of like the minor league, right, with the Challengers and the ITF. The women have a minor league as well. And the men also have a level that is specific to the Olympics every 4 years. So we wanted you to understand what the different levels of tournaments were when we're talking to you throughout the year. So when we say it's a Master Series, you know what that means. When we say it's a Grand Slam tournament, you know what that means. Isaac, is there anything about tournaments that you want to add?
No, nothing really about the tournaments, but basically how the tournaments then kind of feed into what's considered to be the rankings for the players. So I think that's a good transition into that. Players have rankings. So, we've had a lot of females being the number one ranked player in the world. Ash Barty was the number one player. You've got Naomi Osaka, who was the number one player. Serena's been the number one player for a good majority of her career. Venus Williams was the number one player for about 11 weeks. We still
Shame.
love you, V.
Yeah.
Still love you, V. But overall, just at a high level, I want to give you some perspective on how the rankings are established for both the men and women's tour. And it's pretty much similar across the board. So I'm not going to go into too much detail there. But for the most part, you have 16 tournaments that typically make up a player's ranking. It starts off with the Grand Slam tournaments that Bryce talked about. So basically, how well you did in the Grand Slam tournaments, being Australian Open, the French Open, otherwise known or heard or referred to as Roland Garros, Wimbledon, as well as the U.S. Open. So those four Grand Slams count towards your ranking. Outside of those four tournaments, then you've got what's called nine or the Master Series 1000 events that Bryce talked about, or the premier events or tier one. I'm not sure if that's the same term or not, but basically it's those tier premier events on the women's side, and there are about nine of those as well. And so you take the four Grand Slam tournaments, and then you take your Premier and or Master Series events, which is about nine. So those are 13 tournaments that count towards your ranking. And then they have three other floating tournaments. So think of them as like floating days off. You can pick whichever one you want. Doesn't matter, but it will count. So if you decide that you want to take the day after Christmas off, then hey, that is your floating holiday. Same thing from a rankings perspective. You can take the three tournaments where you perform the best at outside of the four Grand Slam tournaments and the Premier/Master Series tournaments, and you can count those towards your ranking. So overall, you have 16 tournaments that make up your ranking as a player, both on the ATP Tour and the WTA Tour. Now, for those of those players who are able to qualify or be within the top 8 of the rankings by the end of the season, they are then invited to participate in what's called the year-ending championships. And both the WTA and the ATP have year-end championship events. So it's very advantageous for you to try and finish or have your ranking be in the top 8 by the end of the season, because if you do, then you're invited to that tournament. And that's where you make up, or that's where the 17th tournament plays into your ranking. If you get invited, you actually get to play matches against the other top 8 players in the world, or top 7 players in the world. And depending upon how you do, if you actually win, you get points that count towards your ranking. So that's really cool, because those are points that no one else outside of the top 8 are able to actually acquire. So you really want to finish anywhere in the top 8 so that you're invited to those year-end championships. And then again, you get extra points for that. So for the top 8, their rankings are made up of 17 tournaments. It's the 16 I mentioned, which again, the 4 Grand Slam tournaments. You've got your 9 Master Series Premier events, and then you've got your 3 floaters. And then again, if you finish in the top 8, then you've got your year-ending championships, and all of those points then make up your ranking. And there is a rolling ranking system, if you will. So just because you finish the year at number 1 doesn't mean that you're number 1 for the following year. It runs on a 52-week cycle, if you will. So as your results from the previous year come up, so say for instance I showed out at the Australian Open and I got to the semifinals. Well, the following year, let's say I got upset in the second round. Well, guess what? There's a whole lot of points that you unfortunately won't have. So those points will come off of your ranking and you will drop in the rolling ranking results. So whereas you may have been, who knows, the number 16 player in the world going into the Australian, when those semifinal results roll off, and you got bounced out in the second round, you could then end up being number 25 player in the world. So again, rankings run on a cycle, but overall, your goal is to really deliver the best 17 results in a calendar year, and then that makes up your year ending ranking. And that's why a lot of people are trying to push for that number one year in ranking, because it means that over the calendar year, you were by far the best player across all of the tournaments that we just talked about. So that at a high level is the ranking system. Bryce, did I miss anything? Or is there anything else relevant that we should talk about in there?
Um, the only thing that I might would add is that as we talk about the tournaments and your ranking, the, the seedings, right?
Ah, that's right. That's right. Yes, please go ahead. Go ahead and talk
So
about that seating.
so most tournaments, and I can say pretty much all tournaments except for Wimbledon, they go the week before it's time to do the draw. So the draw for the tournament, where the players are going to be placed to compete against each other. What they have to do is they take the current rankings, whatever they are, and whoever's number one in the world is the number one seed. Whoever number two in the world, they're the number two seed. And then they either seed 8, 16, 32, depending upon how many people are in the tournament. And then if you're not seeded and you're able to have what they call main draw entry, your ranking is high enough to just get direct entry into the main draw, then at that point you're randomly drawn and placed into the draw. If you're not able, if your ranking is not high enough for you to have direct entry into the main draw, most tournaments have what they call a quali tournament, or what we call a pre-qualification tournament. So you play a little mini tournament the week or the weekend before, and there's usually a number of spots held in the tournament for maybe the top two, the top four, larger tournaments, top eight people that played in the quality tournament for them to be able to play in the main draw. So Wimbledon being that one exception, what they will do is, because the grass court season is so short, and I think I mentioned it's only about 4 weeks, they will take into consideration not only your ranking, but your prior results on the surface, not only at Wimbledon, but also in the grass court lead up tournaments to Wimbledon. So they usually don't make huge adjustments, but if you have somebody, let's say like Roger Federer, who has won Wimbledon 8 times, and you have someone like, let's say, Rafael Nadal, who may be ranked a position ahead of him, but has only won Wimbledon twice. Well, what they'll do is they may switch that and put Roger is number two and Rafa is number three. And that's actually a real life situation that happened this year at Wimbledon, and we heard about it. But it was that's the only tournament that will really do that. And I'm not going to get on my soapbox here. I really don't have an issue with that concept. What I have an issue with Wimbledon is that they only do it for the men.
Right.
And if this strategy makes so much sense, why don't you do it for the women as well? So, it's 2019. We're still trying to get things equal and right, and that's one area where it's still not. But anyway, that's the only thing that I would add to the rankings with the tournaments.
Awesome, awesome. So, Bryce, I kind of have a little change up for you here, because I know that we want to also talk about some of the kind of terminology that we as Brothers on Tennis use across our different podcast shows. I'm thinking we may want to do maybe a BOT 102. And then that way we can kind of keep ourselves focused in on what we've covered here, which is scoring surfaces, tournaments, rankings. That's a nice little package. I think 102 would be really nice, so that we can kind of then bring in the special things that we bring to this wonderful game. What are your thoughts on that?
I guess that's what we'll do.
Well, there you go, folks.
Hey, we're real flexible around here.
That's right. So, folks, folks, what we will do is we'll go ahead and we're gonna kind of let this one go, and we're gonna come at you with a part two, because really when we start talking about some of the things that Brothers on Tennis are known for, Jolly Whopped and breadsticks and things like that, we want to be able to have a little fun with that. And I know that we're pushing on the time right now, so I'd say let's go ahead and wrap up, and we will come back at you with part two of this.
All right. So this is Bryce.
And this is Isaac.
And we are Brothers on Tennis, and we'll see you for part two.